Welcome to the Movement for Beginners podcast presented by YouthLed. I'm your host, Joel Norton. Our objective here is to simplify the movement journey for beginners, from getting started to fulfilling your goals and remaining consistent over time. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, or at youthledcoaching.com. If you're a first-time listener, please refer back to our teaser episode so you can get a better understanding of the purpose of not just this podcast, but YouthLed and myself. Without any further ado, let's dive into today's episode.
Welcome back to Season 6, Episode 3 of the Movement for Beginners podcast. We are going to continue with another client journey today. This may be our last one. I haven't quite decided yet. So we may have some more client journeys coming, or we may move back into some educational topics. But either way, I hope we've got good value out of the first two. And I hope and I think you'll get some really good value out of this one as well, because whilst the first two have been valuable, they sort of follow a trend of, the predictable storyline plot of a movie where we, have some initial challenges and then come through at the end for a successful finale. This one's a bit more, reality based and probably representative of what a lot of movement journeys are like out there, in terms of there's a lot of twists and turns. Where we're at current day with this client doesn't, whilst it's a really good position where we're in, it's not necessarily the, big successful finale you get in, the storybook ending of a movie sometimes. So once again, as a reminder, privacy and confidentiality at the forefront. So we'll keep these really general and broad in terms of how we tell these stories. The value comes from just hearing the anecdotes as opposed to, knowing the ins and outs of the client. So to get going, this is one of my longest serving clients. I've been working with this person since 2019. So I'll be coming up on 6 years by the end of this year, and a lot of different variations in terms of what the service provider looks like, a lot of different variations in terms of the outcomes produced, some good periods, some bad periods, and everything in between. So I think the biggest thing that you can get from this client journey is, something we discussed. I don't think there's so much a specific episode, it's more just a theme we've kind of touched on throughout this podcast and the previous episodes. Life gets in the way. In a perfect world, our physical well-being and how much we move in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year, is in our top couple priorities. In reality, there's many periods throughout a year and throughout a lifespan where it gets bumped down the list. And other stuff gets in the way, whether that's schooling, work, family, health related challenges. So, that's certainly evident in this client journey. Throughout the, coming up on 6 years, there's been many periods where life has got in the way, and factors not related to this client's movement journey have significantly impaired their movement journey. So I suppose there's been times where we've navigated those well. There's been times where we've navigated those poorly. The times where we've navigated those well, we've been able to realize that that old adage of just something is better than nothing, right? So, if we can't get in, going back to our building blocks of movement, if we can't get in our structured forms of training, what's the next best thing we can do? So like walking was incredible for this client during those really busy times. And were they getting big benefits and outcomes from that? No. Were all the outcomes related to physical well-being that they were getting? No. But doing something was providing, it was doing a couple of things. It was providing a little bit of a very small foundation of movement still being present for when we did have periods of life where we can invest more in their movement journey. And it also, which we're going to touch on a little bit later, it added value in other areas as well. So in those periods where life gets busy, our movement journey is going to get, and our physical well-being, it's going to get knocked down the priority list a little bit, but we can't kind of shove it completely off the priority list. So we've got to look at alternate means. So I can't get structured training in, maybe a walk's better instead. So that was what we were able to do well when life got busy for this client and when we were in successful periods. And when life got busy for this client and we weren't successful in just, regressing what we did with their movement journey a little bit, it turned into, we just didn't do anything at all. And they had periods where, really sedentary and completely inactive for extended periods. And that made it really hard then, really, really hard when life did get out of the way and we could get back into their movement journey. It made it really hard to initiate and get back into those steps. So, if you can, from this first point we've raised here, what I would encourage you to take away is on your movement journey, there's going to be periods where life gets busy. And I'm recalling now there's an episode where we spoke about you need to have strategies for those periods of time. So eventually we came around after a period of time that a strategy for this person was, right, if life gets busy, it's all too much for them. They just haven't got the capacity to give a structured form of training. There is a willingness to pull back and just get walking in instead. So plan ahead would be a takeaway from this client journey in this first stop point, and have strategies for when life gets busy. I suppose the next big thing is overcoming what was perhaps this person's biggest barrier. And it ties into when life gets busy a little bit here. From my point of view, this person's biggest barrier, there was a lot, but this person's biggest barrier with regards to their movement journey was time, and both real and perceived. There were some legitimate busy periods where they were caught up in schooling and really were just lacking the time, especially to access a service with me and just aligning schedules. There were other times where it was more about their mental and emotional well-being, their mental and emotional state, and how that influenced their perception of time. So this person would have the time, realistically, to engage in structured forms of training, but the state they were in, it was just leading to their perception of time feeling like they didn't, and they couldn't do it. So our most successful periods were when realistically time was not a factor, and some of those other periods of life weren't becoming overly consuming and influencing their movement journey. But it was also periods where we could challenge perception of time a little bit as well, and that wasn't always easy, but being able to challenge a perception of time, but then also present and deliver whatever the movement service was in a means where to them it didn't feel like a significant time commitment and or a significant stressor, more from a mental and emotional point of view as well. So once again, like what we've touched on in previous client journey episodes, understanding what the barrier is for the client to participation, and then finding strategies to overcome that, but then knowing as well that moving forward, you're just going to have to consistently battle that. And that's something we still battle to this day, right? So little insight, current circumstance with this client, time is not realistically time is not an issue, and they're aware of that. So we're having tremendous success at the moment in terms of, this person's movement journey, but hyper aware that in the future, it's still going to be a barrier for this person. And like all the work they've done now is fantastic, but the real test is going to be when life gets in the way again, and we have to challenge that perceived time barrier again with them. So quick recap of the episode so far. We've touched on life gets in the way. We've touched on having strategies for those periods of time. We've touched on understanding barriers, and we've sort of linked the first two, I suppose, a little bit. Understanding barriers to participation and strategies to remove those, but also knowing you're just going to have to battle against those moving forward. on an ongoing basis. The next thing I want to touch on, which is probably a little bit of a forecast to, a future season of what we're going to do in this podcast, is seeing the value of movement in other components of well-being. So if you're a follower of Youth-Led, we've spoke a lot about components of well-being, and there's physical, and there's emotional, and there's social, and there's spiritual. And there's a significant interrelatedness between these four components. They don't act in isolation. They interact with each other constantly and always will. And for this client, movement quite often, especially in those life get busy moments, especially when they're, being challenged with that time barrier, movement provides value as much in that emotional well-being component as it does in that physical well-being component. So, if we think about our health and our well-being as a holistic endeavor, I suppose tying this back to our first point, and life gets busy, you've got to think about, if life gets busy and I can't get in my structured form of training, which was this client, and that means not going to get as much input into my physical well-being. Well, if I choose a regressed, movement means, which for this client was walking, still going to get a little bit of physical well-being, not quite the same as the structured, but I might be able to tap into some other areas of my well-being, which, overall for my own health is still going to be beneficial. So, for this client, in those periods where life got busy, where time was a barrier, using movement not so much as a physical well-being benefit but as an emotional well-being benefit was tremendous for them to be able to navigate some of those periods and those times. The last thing I wanted to touch on with this client is maintaining engagement over time. So we spoke about this in season 4. As I touched on for this client, coming up on 6, I reckon we're past 6 years of working with them, which is a long time. And, within the fitness industry, certainly you could debate. There's some people would think that's fantastic. Other people would think, you need a new voice. My thing is more like, what's the state of relationship like, and what's the feedback coming from the client? And both are good. So from my point of view, there's a willingness to continue, but there's also a need to try and keep things fresh and maintain engagement over time. So there's been so many different things that we've tried with this client to do so, and some have stuck, some haven't, some have been successful, some haven't. But just to rattle some off, there were periods where we used not so much group-based services and sort of 2-on-1 services. So we'd bring in a social element for this client, which taps in a little bit to, it relates a little bit for them to their drives and motives, also relates to what we forecast before with regards to our components of well-being. Both times, I've done that on a couple of different times with these clients, and both times we've sort of seen an uptick, certainly in engagement, but then in output in terms of within the movement service we're providing. So big ticks there. Other things we've done for this client is not so much stuff we've touched on in previous episodes, but more just trying to reinvent things a little bit, add some novelty, add a different stimulus. Certainly using new environments is good for this client. Getting outdoors is something that's beneficial. We've had successful periods where we've been able to get outdoors and use a new environment. So I think, in terms of this example we're using here, it's a 6-year-long client's service provider relationship. But if you think about your own movement journey, right, it's meant to continue for the end of your life, for the period of your life. So you too will need to find different ways to engage yourself in your movement journey and give yourself new stimulus. As much as you may be attached at the moment to your group fitness class that you go to 3 times a week, I can guarantee you there's going to be a period of time where that becomes dry and stale. And it's also a point that could become a breaking point where you filter out and your movement journey kind of sputters and stops for a bit. So what are your alternate strategies to continue to maintain engagement? As I said, for this client, it was a social stimulus, it was an environmental change. For you, it might be a service change. It could be one of those that I just mentioned then. So knowing that it's a long-term process and it's a long-term journey and you're going to need to pivot and find some new ways to engage yourself over time is really critical. That's the gist of what we're going to get through with this client. It's as I said, a 6-year relationship. It's hard to kind of go through everything. I more just wanted some touch points of some different things that we've touched on throughout this podcast with this client. But I think the takeaway for this one is really critical, and what I'm really proud of this client for is, failure only occurs when you stop, right? So, you can keep missing the mark, but at the same time, if you keep buttering back up and having another go, well, in some way, there's still progression occurring and you're still trying and you've still got a chance to get to wherever you want to go with regards to your movement journey. The only possible scenario where you can't have that happen is when you just decide to stop and give up. And throughout this 6 years, as I said, as much as life has got busy for this client and other external factors have hindered his movement journey, and that time barrier has got in the way for them, they've never stopped. You know what I mean? There's been periods where we've really regressed what we've done. There's been periods where, it's low engagement in the service. There's reluctance to engage in the service, but there's never been a call of, I want to stop and I don't want to do this anymore. And it's been challenging to often pick back up from those low points and get back to, some of the periods like where we are now, where this person's, regularly engaged in structured forms of movement a couple times a week. But their intention to keep trying and keep doing so means that they will eventually get there. It's like what I said at the start, this journey and this takeaway is probably more representative of what the majority of people's movement journeys are like. They're probably not going to follow what we touched on in the first 2 episodes, or what you get in the movie plot where it's kind of a failure and then, we come through and we succeed at the end. It's going to be messy. It's going to be messy often, but if like this client, you can just keep, even in the really trickiest times, if you can keep investing in it in some way and keep trying and when those, times where life doesn't get in the way come around, really put the foot down and try and go for it, then there is still hope that we can move towards, whatever your objective is with regards to your movement journey. As I said at the start, not sure what comes next with this podcast. We could do another movement journey. We could move on to some educational topics. So stay tuned for what comes next on the Movement for Beginners podcast.
Thank you once again for joining us on the Movement for Beginners podcast presented by YouthLed. We are honored that you are sharing your movement journey with us, and all we ask in return is that you like and subscribe on Spotify, like and comment on YouTube, or head over to youthledcoaching.com and join our newsletter and community.